I've made a couple of videos about Murderbot, the book series, the Murderbot Diaries, and the streaming series. And in two of those videos, I used a picture I made uh, based on a scene in the Murderbot Diaries. And I thought it could be fun to talk a little bit about how I made the picture. The first thing to do is, of course, to pick a scene. And I picked a scene from the first book, from page 11. Um, let's see here. I dragged Baradwai out of its mouth and shoved myself in there instead, and discharged my weapon down its throat and then up toward where I hoped the brain would be. I'm not sure if that all happened in that order. I'd have to replay my own field camera feed. All I knew was that I had Baradwai and it had disappeared back down the tunnel. So that's a very short passage, and there is a version of it, of course, in the first episode of the TV series. There's a very short clip from Murderbot. Looking at these frames here, you see that the monster attacks from the left, and I used this as inspiration for the composition of my picture. So it's not the same, but inspired by. I started off by building the scene in Daz Studio. Now, I won't do a complete description of how I worked in Daz Studio. I'll just make an overview here. So in DAS, you work with ready-made picture elements or 3D models. And as you can see, I have a lot of them. So I picked a character and set it up, and I used a ready-made armor for that character. And when I had that, the next thing to do was to work on a monster. I knew I wanted a monster in a sand pit. So the first thing I do was to check if I had any sand monsters. And yeah, I do have a package with sand creatures, but those are, well, one of them is similar to the monster in the Murderbot series, but it's actually more close to a dune sandworm. So I decided not to use that. Instead, I went for a monster worm. Uh, this is also a sand designed to be a sand monster, but it's more aligned with what I wanted. So let's see here. I've actually got all of these loaded in DOS right now. So and I've got it positioned like this. So we can actually have a closer look at it. Uh, the monster explodes up from underground. So I also placed a lot of rubble in the scene. And I then, when I had the basic elements there, I placed a camera. At first, I had thought I would use a vertical camera, but I soon figured out that it would be better to use a camera that has the same format as a widescreen, 16:9. That would make it a little bit closer to what a TV series is using. So I set up a camera like this, and then all I had to do was to add in various elements. So I set up a ground and background elements, continued with some elements in the back, like alien flowers, uh, a small animal in in the front of the scene. I have my scenes divided into three levels. Foreground, like this, middle ground, and usually also background. This time I didn't use any background elements. And then I divide each depth level into front, middle, and back. I added a dust cloud, but I decided not to use it. I actually painted the dust cloud in later, and I'll show you how I did that. And I added some plants and baradwai, like this. I then set up everything for rendering. I won't show you the actual render because that takes a lot of time. I'll just show you a preview like this. Okay, here we are in Affinity Photo. Um, I I imported the various layers, and you can see the bottom layer here is actually the whole complete picture as rendered from DAS. But then I started to add in various layers, and this is where it gets interesting. I created a backdrop, which is just a blue layer and then some clouds on top of it. And then I created a new ground layer, for which I used the picture that contains only the ground part. But what I did then was that I added in the complete picture with a mask like this. If I turn the mask off, we get back the original picture. Turn the mask on, and what I get now is a little bit of shadow here. And I could have created that shadow manually, but I wanted to do it as accurately as possible. I got a little bit of the hand and the body too, but that doesn't matter because there will be another picture on top of that later on. Another thing I did, which I didn't actually add in until later, was a bit of shadowing uh, up here. And I'll show you later why I did that. Okay, so on to the next layer, middle ground. Okay, that's a lot. I'll turn the sand cloud off. So here we got plants and we got Baradwai and we also got the monster. Now the monster I did split up in parts by masking. Um, and I I worked a lot on that and did some cloning of the eyes because I wasn't happy with what they looked like. Uh, I also added in the complete Murderbot picture. If I remove that, you see that shadows don't look as good. So there was a lot of detail work here. At this point, I also added a sand cloud, and I built that sand cloud up layer by layer. We can see that a single layer can be almost invisible. So here's a single layer. Here's a layer where I've added some particles, added more sand, and I build it up layer by layer until I've got got it the way I want. When I added the particles, I also added some motion blur, like this. If I turn the motion blur off, well, doesn't look, it makes a little bit of difference. I started working on the foreground, and in the foreground I had the character sec unit, and I did add in the complete picture because that in the complete picture the armor has a bit of reflection from the surrounding environment, so the color is a little bit different. If I turn it off, it may be difficult to see in a YouTube video, but if I flick this on and off, on and off and on, there is a slight color change in the armor. One thing I wanted there to be a difference in color, in the light value between the armor and the background. So I used a layer to brighten the upper body. And of course, the sand cloud here was built up layer by layer as before. If I turn the individual layers off, so I have foreground layers here. The reason why we can see a little bit of sand here is because that sand is actually on the sand falling from monster layer, like that. So there are a lot of sand layers, and I find that it's best to build this up little by little. So here's a particle layer again. I have two sand layers which made the effect a little bit too strong, so I don't have them turned on. And then we've got more particles, and then a sand cloud, heavier sand cloud, and more sand falling. When I had all that, I saved it out, and what I did then was that I ran the picture through a special application, the Dynamic Auto Painter, and I'll show you how I did that too. Okay, so here we are in Dynamic Auto Painter. I have loaded the picture I rendered out from Affinity Photo, and the first thing I did, Dynamic Auto Painter is an application that takes a picture, breaks it down into parts, and then paints it in various styles. And as you can see, there are a lot of different styles here. I chose one that I like, Portraitist. There are various settings you can use in order to vary how the picture will be painted. I told Dynamic Auto Painter to use the colors in the picture. I set it to extra large. I turned the canvas emulation off, and now I'm going to start the painting process. This particular painting filter uses a mask. I used the mask to paint the figure here. And what the mask does is it doesn't work like a mask in most other programs. It just tells Dynamic Auto Painter that this is an area Auto Painter should be extra careful with, preserve as much detail as possible. Okay, and then we'll just run the program. Now, while the program is running, right now it's analyzing the image. When it starts running, there are a few things I can do to affect the way it works. one thing is that now it starts painting the background, and then it starts filling in large areas, and I can tell it to pay more attention to certain areas, like I'm doing here and here, and that just affects a little bit how it paints the large colored areas. There is I can tell it to use a finer brush here if I want to ensure that there is a little bit more detail here. But by and large, Auto Painter decide how it's going to paint this picture. There are areas where Auto Painter creates a too dark picture, and I'm filling in those a little bit. So it will be a little bit more careful. Okay, now we'll let Auto Painter work. Okay, while Auto Painter is working, I can start touching up the picture a little bit using a soft reveal brush. Now, I can do this afterwards too, and I usually wait until this phase is done, because fixing this afterwards is actually faster and more efficient. Okay, so now Dynamic Auto Painter is done, but I am not. I want to touch this up quite a bit before this part of the process is done. Uh, I can use the soft reveal brush. I have increased the size, and I paint over. In this case, I'm going to paint over everything. Depending on what I do, I often paint over just a part of the picture. But as you can see, this reveals a little bit more of the original. So if I do this 3 or 4 times, okay, like that, I finish by adjusting the color a bit, uh, perhaps brightening the picture a little bit because it's a desert and I want it bright, but I also want a little bit more contrast so we can see what's going on. Uh, I usually reduce the pigment brilliance as much as I can, and in this case I will also reduce the highlights a little bit. Okay, done. Now this is not a finished picture. I'll save this picture to disk, and then I'll import it into Affinity Photo. Uh, so hang on. Okay, so we are back in Affinity Photo, and what I have done now is that I have added the painted picture from Dynamic Auto Painter. The layer is invisible right now, but I'll click here and it's visible. And what I can do now is that I just reduce the opacity to around 30%. And that gives me a mix of photorealistic ray tracing and a little bit of extra grittiness. If we zoom in a bit, you can see the difference. So, um, and one more thing is that I'll also add a white balance adjustment to give it a bit more color. What I use there is around a 10% white balance adjustment. And then I also added a little bit of vibrance to the picture. And I reduced the vibrance and I reduced the saturation a little bit for a finishing touch. Okay, one thing that isn't immediately obvious is when I describe this is that I do lots and lots of intermediate versions, as you can see here. There are plenty of them, and I do various variants when I work. And after I recorded most of this video yesterday, I noticed a mistake I had made. Uh, and the mistake was that in my final version here, we had this gap here. Um, this was because I had actually placed a bit of rock here, but I had left it turned off in DAS. So I decided to make a new version, and that is exactly what I did. We can see it here. This is the version I did after the rest of the video. If I change the viewpoint here, uh, now we have a rock here, so we don't have that unsightly gap. And of course, when I had done that, I had to redo the painting in Dynamic Auto Painter, and I made some other minor changes. Um, Also, I did everything in 16 to 9 format, same as a normal screen or iPad. But then I thought, well, the Murderbot streaming series is actually filmed in 2.35 to 1. So what I did was I didn't crop this picture. Instead, I used the export persona to do a crop on export. So now I can export both 16 to 9 and a 2.35 to 1 version, which is what I did. So and I think that if we look at the 2.35 to 1 version, that is a little bit more cinematic. It brings us closer to the action. So I think that's my preferred choice, even if it doesn't look very good on, say, a phone or a other very small screen. I make most of my pictures for large screens, or in some cases, even printing them and hanging them on a wall. So I can afford the luxury of using a cinematic format for my pictures. Okay, that's it. A long, convoluted process, but it gets me the result I want. So now you know how I make pictures. Be seeing you.